I grew up in the nursery business. My dad had a 400-plus acre nursery in Bowmanville, and my first full-time job was when I was about 8 years old, labeling steaks. So I learned plant material names from a very early age and got very interested, obviously, in horticulture. My dad was a graduate of OAC in 1937 and insisted that I would go to OAC as well. I didn't think it was a good idea at the time. I would much rather have gone to work for the Goodyear Tire and Rubber Company and bought myself a car, but instead I went to university, which was probably the best thing that ever happened to me. Ended up in a program called Landscape Horticulture. The director of the program was Vic Chanasic. Vic Chanasic was, I think, the father of landscape architectural education in Canada by starting the first LA program at the University of Guelph. I wasn't fortunate enough because I was too early. So the first program started in the year after I graduated, or the year that I did graduate from Guelph. So I went off to Michigan after that and got a master's degree in landscape architecture. And I went to Michigan to be a landscape architect because of Vic Chanasic, probably the most influential person in my career as a landscape architect. Before that, though, I had an opportunity to work for Project Planning Associates as a summer student when I was at the University of Guelph. And the really exciting part was working on the University of Guelph master plan, campus master plan. I was a 24, 25-year-old kid. Started a field office in the horticulture building at the university for Project Planning Associates, and worked with people that came from Cambridge, Massachusetts, and from Toronto to do the master plan, do the beginnings of the master plan for the university. When I went to Michigan, I came back to project planning in the summer, and then came back to project planning and worked for them until 1969, when Vic Chanasic again called me and said, "You have an opening at the university for a professor. We need you to come and teach." And I said, "You don't need a 27-year-old kid to come and teach. I don't know anything yet. I'm just starting in the profession." He said, "You know enough." So anyway, I got a job as a teacher, and I stayed there for 13 years teaching at the University of Guelph. Teaching was a great experience, wonderful experience. I think I was probably more influenced by my students than I was by anybody else. I'm still influenced by those students, the ones who graduated during those early years in the program. The university was a place for me to rub shoulders with people from other professions as well. I'd learned from Project Planning Associates that working with engineers and architects and sociologists and other professionals was the way to go. That's what project planning was all about. It was a very well-rounded firm in that way. And Guelph became the same kind of place for me. I actually started a firm called Ecological Services for Planning. ESP was made up of soil scientists, biologists, climatologists, landscape architects, engineers, and we did a whole raft of work that was perhaps groundbreaking at the time, back in the late 60s, early 70s. And I think that teaching got to be not enough for me, so I decided that I wanted to go out into private practice, and in 1977 I joined a couple of my faculty members and a bunch of former students, and the firm, the Land Plan Collaborative Limited, was founded and lasted until a couple of years ago when we all retired. The firm carries on now with our former employees, but all of the original principals are now retired from the firm. In 1969, Vic said to me, "You are going to teach A, B, and C," and A was the history of landscape architecture. And I said, "I can't teach history of landscape architecture. I hate history. I don't know anything about history. I'm really not interested in history." And he said, "Too bad." that's your job. So I boned up on as much as I could about the history of landscape architecture, and it's become my passion. So I started some pretty original research, really, back in the early 70s on heritage landscapes in Ontario especially. Wrote some papers, got them published in international journals. Was very fortunate in that I had half a dozen students who had the same kind of interest and went on to do some really groundbreaking work in heritage work. And since that time, I've been involved in mostly heritage landscape work, but lately heritage impact assessments, which are not limited to landscapes, but deal with architecture and the full gamut of planning aspects of heritage. I think when I started looking at the cultural landscape, we didn't value the cultural landscape. The natural landscape did have value for people, for a lot of people. It didn't for a lot of other people as well. But the cultural landscape, nobody really thought very much about it, or very few people thought very much about it. It's become much more important than it was by a long shot. I think we respect our rural landscape much more so than we did respect our rural landscape 50 years ago. I still think we have a heck of a long way to go. I'll give you an example of heritage registers in municipalities where buildings almost exclusively are in urban areas that are on the heritage register. There are dozens and dozens of farmsteads and farm buildings and farm landscapes and agricultural landscapes that really belong on a heritage register. Most municipalities don't have those aspects on their heritage register. But it's starting to change. And that's something I think we're going to see more of. We're going to have more knowledge and more respect for our rural landscapes and our rural heritage. Jack Wright wasn't a landscape architect, or isn't a landscape architect. He was a resource planner with the School of Resource Planning at the University of Guelph years ago, and then went off to Ottawa. But Jack was very much involved in the School of Landscape Architecture, and that was his motto. He figured that being humble and hustling was the way to get things done. Jack Milliken, another landscape architect and a former professor at the University of Guelph, had a slightly different motto, and his motto was do good work and tell people about it. So that's not being terribly humble, but it works probably just as well. I thought about this a lot. There are a couple of things. One is the OALA founding in 1968. I think a lot of people would say it's the Act. I don't think it's the Act. The Act came out of the founding of the OALA. And the reason I think that that was a turning point is that that's the first time in the province that landscape architects had a collective voice. The CSLA existed from 1934, and we were members of the Canadian Society of Landscape Architects, but it was a national organization, and it really wasn't a local organization, and there was no real strong collective local voice. The OALA became that collective voice. And it was not just, it wasn't really provincial, it was really two cities. It was Ottawa and it was Toronto. Nonetheless, that voice, I think, was the turning point for landscape architects. Almost no municipalities had landscape architects on staff. I don't think any did back in 1968. If they did, there were very few. We could look to the CMHC and the National Capital Commission as probably the only public agencies that had landscape architects on staff. After the OALA was founded, and with the students that came out of the University of Guelph and the University of Toronto, all kinds of landscape architects started to be engaged by municipalities. Most of them weren't called landscape architects, they were called park planners, but they were landscape architects nonetheless. And that was a real turning point, because that meant that these young people who had all kinds of great ideas were now in a position of responsibility, in a position of authority, so that they could engage landscape architects to do the work that municipalities were doing. So I think that was, in my mind, that's a real turning point. And perhaps one of the other things was the whole baby boom of the 50s and the 60s, where major projects were being undertaken, like new universities and old universities being reborn, like the University of Guelph, Waterloo, York, etc. And landscape architects were in charge of most of those projects. And that's something that hadn't happened for a very long time. So there was a combination of things. We didn't have any landscape architects to speak of in the province as a pool to choose from in terms of trying to hire people. So we went to the States. And I would think of the OALA members in 1968, maybe a third of us were Americans. Most of them stayed. Not all of them, but most of them. Walter was just here. Walter was one of them. Steve Moorhead's coming. He's another one. All of those people that we revere as being, not all of them, but many of them that we revere as being the pioneers of the 60s and the 70s in landscape architecture were Americans. Then the students came along from Guelph and Toronto, and we didn't need to import landscape architects anymore. As a matter of fact, we now export landscape architects. All kinds of my students have ended up in the States. I was looking for one that had been in the City of London for a long time, and I looked him up online, and I find out that he's been in Florida for the last 10 years. We're in California. They're all over the place. If there's a solution, or if we're looking for solutions, I think we need to look for natural solutions. And landscape architects have been in the forefront of looking for natural solutions to design and planning for millennia. Conservation is obviously the way to go. We talked earlier about fossil fuels and the issues of fossil fuels and whatnot. I'm not sure that fossil fuels are as big a deal as chopping down rainforests and cutting down trees in order to produce more power, one way or another. I think about the stuff that we were doing in the early 1970s and the late 1960s in terms of revegetation and restoration of streams. Fletcher's Creek in Brampton and Little Etobicoke Creek in Mississauga, for instance. Most people look at those places today and think that they've always looked like that. They were ditches. They were concrete lined channels. They were engineered solutions that weren't solutions. Landscape architects changed that, re-engineered them, if you like, and turned them back into natural areas. But that's the direction that we've been going, and that's the direction that we have to continue to go if we're going to do anything about climate change at all. We need to think about the big picture in terms of the professions working together. Landscape architects need to continue to be, and even more so, well-rounded people. They need to know as much as they can possibly know about conservation, about biology, but not all of us do. There are different places for us to be. For instance, I'm really involved in heritage planning, which it has a lot to do with conservation, but it's not conservation of natural resources, it's conservation of cultural resources. There are landscape architects who are involved in the public participation process, who specialize in dealing with people and convincing people to do the right thing, which is just as important as designing a great park or a great landscape. So there are lots of different places for us to be, but we still need each and every one of us as landscape architects, I think, to be as well-rounded as we can possibly be. The programs at Guelph and Toronto have always done that, and I think they continue to do that. Oh, I don't know where they are now, but where they have been in the past, at least for me, budget was always an issue, which is always an issue for anybody that's involved in designing anything that's going to get built. And landscape architects were always on the tail end of things. The building gets built and there's no money left over for the landscape, so landscape budget gets cut, and the thing that you designed doesn't get built, or it gets half built, or it doesn't get built very well, or whatever. So that was always an issue. Finding good contractors was an issue. Back in the 60s and the 70s and the 80s, there was a great deal of difficulty finding good contractors. I'm not involved anymore in design and construction work, so I don't know what the situation is now. Hopefully it's improved. Finding talent was always an issue. We were very fortunate in our firm because we had a pool of landscape students that we dealt with, and so we could pick the best students and convince them to come and work for us, and they did. Not everybody was in that enviable position. But what got me inspired were teachers and fellow professionals, people like Walter Kim, people like Steve Moorhead, Mac Hancock, Don Pettit. What kept me inspired were my students. And as I said a little while ago, many of those students still keep me inspired. And I still stay in touch with many of those students. They're doing great stuff. Their kids are doing great stuff now, which really starts to make me feel old. And I'm really not that old, I don't think. I'm constantly aware of how much we've learned and how far we've progressed in the last 50 years as a profession. And I also amazed when I think about the past of how much we knew 50 years ago and how advanced we were compared to many members of professional society in terms of looking after our environment, of dealing with the issues that have become to the forefront now, like climate change.